He had been shot on a Thursday, which Ro Haynes found out on a Friday when the call came at 2 in the morning. She was used to calls at 2 in the morning. 15 years of night nursing, and the 2 in the morning call was as familiar as the sound of the refrigerator in her apartment, which was also present at 2 in the morning when the call came. Because she was awake, and in the kitchen with the particular insomnia that came at the end of a run of day shifts before a rotation change. The woman who called identified herself as a medical coordinator for a private agency and gave Ro an address and a patient status in the same sequence she might have given a weather report, which was male, 38. Post-surgical day 3. Fever spiking. Previous nursing arrangements had fallen through. Was she available? She was available. She was always available at 2 in the morning in a rotation change week. She said yes and wrote down the address and changed her clothes and took her kit and went. The address was in a part of the city where the buildings were old and had been expensively maintained, so that they looked old in the way that things that cost money looked old, which was dignified rather than deteriorated. The door was opened by a man who did not introduce himself and who looked at her ID with the specific attention of someone who had been told to look at it carefully and took the instructions seriously. And then he took her upstairs and through 2 more doors that were opened with cards rather than keys, and to a room at the end of a hallway that was quiet, in a way that hallways were quiet when there were people in adjacent rooms who were not making noise. The room had a hospital bed that was not a hospital, the kind of bed that was brought in for long-term care that was not going to take place in a hospital. And in it was a man who was, she assessed in the first 30 seconds, running a fever of approximately 39.4, and was in the specific category of post-surgical patients who had not yet crossed the threshold from concerning to stable. He was large, which she noted as a clinical fact about managing his position for the next several hours. He had the face of someone who was used to presenting as controlled and was not currently controlling anything. The sheets were hospital grade, and someone had started an IV line and done it correctly, which was more than she could say for some of the medical arrangements she had walked into in 15 years of this work. She put down her kit. She looked at the chart that was on the table beside the bed, which was handwritten in the shorthand of someone who knew what they were doing. She looked at the IV. She looked at the patient. She began. The first 2 hours were clinical work and nothing else. She checked the surgical site through the dressing, which was in order. She adjusted the IV rate. She took vitals at 30-minute intervals and logged them. The fever was high, but not higher than it had been, which was progress of a kind. The kind that was not progress, but was at least not regression. And she had learned in 15 years to take the not regression nights as the thing they were, and not wish them into being something more. At some point between 3 and 4 in the morning, the man in the door came in and stood against the wall and watched her work. And she did not look at him because she was watching the patient, and because the presence of someone watching her work was common, and she had learned not to perform for it. He left after approximately 10 minutes. She did not note his exit any more than she had noted his entry. At 4:12, the fever broke. It broke the way fevers broke in patients who were not going to die from them, which was with the specific quality of release that she had learned to read in a room the way other people read weather. And she stood at the side of the bed and watched his breathing change from the shallow, fast quality of fever to the slower, deeper quality of actual sleep. And she thought, all right. And she sat down in the chair by the window because she was allowed to sit now that the acute part of the night was over. And she opened her chart, and she wrote the time and the temperature and the change, and she documented the IV adjustment, and she looked at the clock, and she thought about the morning. She did not think about the patient as a person. This was a thing she had trained herself in over 15 years. The specific discipline of not thinking about patients as people during the acute phase of care. Because thinking about them as people during the acute phase was a way of spending attention you needed for something else. She would think about him as a person when it was appropriate to think about him as a person, which was not now. The room was quiet. The city outside the window was doing its 4 a.m. things, which were minimal. She wrote notes. She looked at the chart. She looked at the bed, and at the man in it, who was sleeping properly now, and who had the particular stillness of someone in actual unconscious sleep, rather than the performed stillness of fever. She thought about the dressing and about the IV, and about whether she had everything she needed from the notes to brief whoever came in the morning. She was looking at the table by the bed when she noticed the book. It was a small book, paperback, with a worn spine that suggested it had been read multiple times. It was sitting on the bedside table at the far edge, which was not where she would have placed it if she had been the person who placed it. She would have put it closer to the lamp, where it could be reached easily. The far edge was where something ended up when it had been picked up and set back down without full attention, the way you set something down when you were doing something else. She looked at the book. She looked at the patient, who was asleep. She thought someone has been reading in this room recently, because the book was closer to the lamp when she arrived, and it was now at the far edge. She considered this, and found no immediate explanation, and filed it under things she would note and not act on, which was the second category she had developed alongside the first, and she went back to her notes. At 6:15 she was relieved by a day nurse whose name was Thomas, and who was competent, and who she briefed in 8 minutes, and who she left with the chart and the contact for the medical coordinator, the specific instruction to call her if the temperature rose above 38.8 before she came back in the evening. She went home. She slept for 6 hours. She went back. The book was at the near edge of the table when she arrived. She had not moved it. Thomas had not moved it. She knew this because Thomas's briefing had been thorough, and he would have mentioned anything unusual and had not. The man in the bed was asleep. Temperature 38.1 and stable. And she looked at the book, and she looked at him, and she thought, this is information I don't have context for yet. She put on gloves and checked the dressing and adjusted the IV and logged the vitals and did not touch the book. At midnight, the man in the door came again and stood against the wall and watched her, and this time she did look at him. Briefly, because the professional thing to do was acknowledge a presence that had been there twice, and he looked back at her with the expression of someone doing a job that required watching and finding what he was watching acceptable. She looked back at the patient. She did her work. At 2 a.m, she sat in the chair by the window, and she looked at the patient and she thought, he has been shot, and he is not going to die from it, and he is 38 years old. And the security in this building is the security of someone who understands that people want to do them harm. She thought about these facts in the clinical way, the way she thought about patients as people when it was appropriate, which was when they were stable and she had attention to spare. She thought, I don't know who he is, and I don't need to know who he is, and that is correct. And I will come back tomorrow night, and that is also correct. She wrote her notes. She did not think about the book at the far edge of the table when she arrived, and the near edge when she left, which was not thinking about something in the specific way that meant she was thinking about it very carefully. She briefed Thomas in the morning, and she went home, and she thought 12 nights. Probably, maybe 14. And then he will not need continuous nursing care. She thought about 12 nights, and she thought about the book, and she thought about the man in the bed who had a face that was used to being controlled and was not currently controlling it. And she thought, I don't know him, and that is correct, and I will go back tonight. And that is also correct. She slept. She went back. The book had moved again, 3 inches to the right, which put it directly beside the lamp, which was exactly where you would put it if you were going to read. She looked at the patient. She looked at the book. She checked his vitals, which were 37. Joe, which was the best they had been since she arrived. She adjusted the IV. She sat in the chair by the window, and she did her notes, and she thought about nothing except the work, which was what she was here for, which was entirely and only correct. She did not look at the book again. At 4 a.m, she was tired in the way she was tired at the end of the first good night, which was the good tiredness, the tiredness of a patient who was not going to die. And she sat in the chair, and she let herself be tired, and she looked at the patient, and she thought, all right, you're going to be all right. She did not say it out loud. She had learned in 15 years not to say things out loud that were for herself and not for the patient, because it confused the work with something that was not the work. And she was very careful about what the work was. She looked at the book on the table beside the lamp. She did not touch it. She did not need to touch it. She was a person who had been doing this for 15 years, and she had very good attention, and she could read the title from where she was, sitting, which was 3 feet from the table. She read the title and she thought interesting. She wrote in her notes, patient condition stable, IV adjusted, temperature 37, Joe, continuing improvement. She wrote nothing about the book. It was not a clinical fact, and her notes were clinical facts, and that was what they were for. She briefed Thomas in the morning. She went home. She slept. She came back. She was going to come back for 12 nights. Probably. She did not think about what happened after 12 nights. She thought about tonight, which was the work, which was what she was here for. The 9th night was a Thursday. She knew this because she had been counting. Not deliberately, but in the way that you counted things when there was a fixed endpoint you were moving toward. And 12 was the fixed endpoint she had been given, which meant she was 3/4 of the way through a thing that had, by the 9th night, become less like work and more like routine. And routine was the thing she was most careful about. Routine was where the discipline broke down. 15 years had taught her that. You came in on the first night and the second night and the third night with the full professional distance, the trained attention that was for the work and nothing outside the work. And somewhere in the middle of a long placement, the work became so familiar that the distance became familiar too, and familiarity was not distance, and that was where you had to be careful. She had learned this from a patient in her 4th year who had been in her care for 3 weeks and who had died on a Monday morning and whose death she had felt in a way she had not been prepared for. And she had gone home and sat in her apartment, and she had understood you have let the work become something else. She had been more careful since then. She was careful now. On the 9th night, walking through the hall with her kit and her chart and her 15 years of learned caution. And she was careful when she opened the door, and she was careful when she looked at the patient, whose vitals Thomas had logged at 37.3, and who was sleeping in the specific way of someone whose body had decided to spend its energy on repair rather than fever. She was careful when she noticed the book was back at the near edge. She checked the dressing. She checked the IV. She logged her arrival vitals, which were 37R, which was essentially normal, and which she wrote down with the particular satisfaction she had never stopped feeling when numbers went in the right direction. She sat in the chair by the window, and she opened her chart, and she wrote her notes, and she was careful. At midnight, the man from the door came and watched and left. She looked at him briefly and looked back at the patient. At 1 a.m, she had finished all the notes that needed finishing, and she was in the specific state that came on the good nights, which was not tired and not awake, but somewhere in the middle. The particular quality of sustained attention that her body had learned to maintain over many years without requiring sleep. She had her chart and her pen, and she looked at the patient, and she thought about the last 9 nights, and she did not mean to start talking, and then she did. The book moved again, she said. She said it quietly. The volume she used when she was in a room with someone sleeping. The volume that was technically speaking, but practically. Silence. She was not talking to him. She was thinking out loud in the specific way she thought out loud when she was alone, which she was, effectively, in the way she had been effectively alone in rooms with patients for 15 years. "I've been watching it," she said, not watching it, noticing it. She looked at the near edge of the table where the book was. "I know the explanation. I've always known the explanation. The explanation is that I'm wrong about Thomas not moving it, or that someone else comes in during the day that I don't know about, or that it's simply not moving and I'm miscounting the inches." She paused. "I'm not miscounting the inches." The room was quiet. The patient's breathing was slow and even, and entirely the breathing of sleep. "It's a good book," she said. "You have good taste. Or someone who chose it for you has good taste. Which is also information." She looked at the window, which showed the particular deep blue of the city at 1 a.m. "I read the first chapter once, in a waiting room. I never finished it. I always meant to go back." She paused. "I don't go back to things usually. I'm not very good at it." She was aware that she was talking. She was aware that talking was the thing she did when the 9th night of a 12-night placement arrived, and the routine had become familiar, and the distance had become the thing she was careful about. And she was talking to a room, which was not the same as talking to a person. And this was the distinction she was maintaining. "You're doing well," she said. "Medically. You're doing very well. The surgical site is clean, and the fever's been gone for 5 days, and your body is doing what it needs to do." She wrote a note, a real note, in the chart, the temperature and the time. "You'll probably be out of this bed in another week. Thomas thinks sooner. I think Thomas is optimistic. But Thomas has been doing this for 8 years, and I've been doing it for 15. And in my experience, optimistic is usually wrong by approximately 48 hours. She paused. "That's not a complaint. 48 hours is not very much." She looked at her chart. She wrote another note. "I don't know what you do," she said. "I know the building, and I know the security, and I know you came to me through a private agency at 2 a.m. And I've been doing this long enough to know what that usually means. And I've been doing this long enough to know it's not my business." She looked at the window. "I did look you up. I want to be honest about that. I looked you up on the 3rd night because I thought it was better to know than not know, in case knowing was relevant to the medical care." She paused. "It wasn't relevant to the medical care. You're a person who needs a surgical site kept clean and a temperature monitored and IV fluids managed, and it doesn't matter who you are for any of that." She paused again. "But I looked you up, and I know who you are. And I want you to know that I know and that it doesn't change how I'm doing this. Because it doesn't." The patient breathed. The room was quiet. The clock on the wall was the specific ticking kind that she had come to associate with long night shifts. The kind that marked time without making it feel longer. "I'm going to miss this," she said. She had not meant to say it. It arrived the way the other things had arrived, from the specific region of herself that she did not manage very well at 1 a.m. on the 9th night of a 12-night placement. And she sat with the having said it for a moment, and she thought about whether to go back and qualify it, and she decided not to. Because qualifying things at 1 a.m. in a room with a sleeping patient was its own kind of category error. "Not the work," she said. "The work is the work, and I'll have other work. I mean the quiet." She looked at the room. "I've spent a lot of nights in a lot of rooms, and most of them are just rooms. This room is—" She stopped. She started again. "This is a good room to be in at 1 a.m. I don't know why. I've tried to figure it out, and I can't, and I've decided it's not something that requires figuring out." She was quiet for a moment. The patient was quiet. She looked at the book on the near edge of the table, and she thought about the title she had read from 3 feet away, and the chapter she had read in a waiting room and never gone back to. She thought, I am on the 9th night of 12, and I am sitting in a room with a man I have been caring for 9 nights, and I have just said out loud that I am going to miss this room. And that is not the same as saying, I am going to miss him. And it is also not entirely different. And I am going to think about that later, when it is not 1 in the morning. She looked at the bed. She looked at his hand. The hand was on top of the sheet, which was where hands usually were in the 2nd week of recovery. When the body had decided it was not in immediate danger and had relaxed its grip on everything it had been gripping, she had positioned his hand herself several times in the course of the last 9 nights, adjusting for circulation, and she knew the position of his hand at rest, the way she knew the vitals and the surgical site and the particular sound of his breathing. The hand moved. It was not the reflexive movement of sleep, the small involuntary adjustments that came from the body maintaining circulation. It was a controlled movement, the movement of a hand that was being directed by a mind that was awake. And it lasted approximately 1 second, and then it stopped, and the hand was still. She looked at his face. His face was the face of someone asleep. His breathing was the breathing of someone asleep. His eyes were closed in the particular way of closed eyes that were not performing being closed, but were simply closed. She looked at the hand. She looked at the face. She looked at the chart. She wrote 0104. Patient, resting. Vitals, stable. She did not write anything about the hand. A hand moving was not a clinical event if the patient's face was the face of sleep, and the breathing was the breathing of sleep. And she had checked the sedation schedule, and he was not sedated. She thought he could be in lighter sleep than I've assessed. She thought that is the most likely explanation. She thought, I am going to note the time and continue monitoring. She noted the time. She continued monitoring. She did not say anything else for the rest of the night. At 2:15, she gave him a position adjustment and checked the dressing and looked at his face, which was the face of sleep, and looked at his hand, which was still. She wrote in the chart. She sat in the chair. She was careful. At 6, she briefed Thomas, and she said, stable night. 37, due on arrival, and Trenta set. 0. At close. Surgical site. Clean. IV running at the adjusted rate. She did not say. I talked for 20 minutes at 1 in the morning, and then his hand moved. She did not say this, because she was not certain what she had seen, and she did not report things she was not certain of, and because the alternative explanation, which was that she had said things out loud in the room of a patient who was awake rather than asleep, was an explanation she was not prepared to act on yet. She went home. She sat in her kitchen. She was very still for a long time. She thought, he is a person who reads. She thought the book moved 3 times. She thought a hand moved at 1 in the morning and then stopped. She made coffee. She drank it. She thought, I am going to go back tonight, and I am going to be careful. She went to sleep. She came back. The 12th night was a Sunday. She had known it was coming the way she always knew the last night was coming, with the specific mixture of readiness and reluctance that she had never fully resolved in 15 years and had stopped trying to resolve because some things were simply present in the work and were not problems to be solved but conditions to be inhabited. She put on her coat, and she took her kit, and she walked to the building. And she was admitted by the man at the door, who now looked at her ID with the mechanical familiarity of someone who had looked at the same ID 12 times and knew it by heart. Thomas's briefing was brief because the night had been unremarkable. 37, 1 at handoff. Surgical site clean. IV running at the adjusted rate. Patient had taken water twice during the afternoon and had kept it down, which was the most significant clinical development of the week, and which Thomas delivered with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that the unremarkable was the goal. She went into the room. The book was not on the table. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at where the book had been, and at the table, and at the patient, who was in the position she had last left him in, which was the position she had adjusted him into at 5:40 on Saturday morning. She looked at the absence of the book. She filed it. She did her work. She checked the dressing, which was very nearly ready to be replaced with a lighter bandage, which was progress of the concrete kind. She checked the IV, which would come out in 2 days at the rate his fluid intake was improving. She logged the vitals 37. Ling, which was normal, which was what she had been working toward. She sat in the chair by the window, and she opened her chart, and she wrote her notes, and she was careful. She was very careful tonight. She had been careful since the 9th night, since the hand, since the conversation she had with herself in her kitchen at 6:45 in the morning about what she had seen and what it phones meant and what the most responsible interpretation of it was. She had arrived at a position, which was the most responsible interpretation, was that she had been talking in a room for 20 minutes and a patient in light sleep. He had registered her presence with a small movement, and that she should be more careful about talking in rooms. This was the position she had maintained for 3 nights, and it was a good position, and she was maintaining it. She did not talk. The room was quiet in the particular way it was quiet on good nights, which was fully, without the undercurrent of tension that came with fever or uncertain vitals. Just the clock and the city outside and the sound of his breathing, which she had memorized in the way she memorized sounds that were part of a nighttime environment she was responsible for. At 1 in the morning she stood up from the chair and she went to do the position check, which was the check she did every 90 minutes through the night to ensure circulation and prevent the complications that came with long immobility. She came to the left side of the bed and she checked the position of his hands, which were on the sheet, and the angle of his neck, which was correct. And she checked the IV line, and she looked at the dressing, and she was doing all of this with the same attention she had brought to the work for 12 nights. She was going to leave in 5 hours. She was not going to come back after that, or not as his nurse, which was the only category in which she had been here. And she knew this, and it was correct, and she was not going to make it into something it was not. She looked at him. He had the face of sleep. She had memorized his face, the way she had memorized his breathing and his resting hand position, and the particular quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a person who was accustomed to being still as a choice, and had now been still as a necessity for 12 days, and whose body was ready to stop being still and was being patient about it. She thought, in 5 hours I will leave, and this will be done, and that is what it should be. She thought, I have been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people in 15 years, and this is one of them. And when I leave tonight, it will become one of the ones I remember as a good one. The quiet ones. The ones where the patient was going to be all right. She thought, I am going to miss this room. She had said this on the 9th night. She had said it out loud and she had meant it, and she was still saying it now, internally, in the way she said things internally that she was not going to say out loud again, because she had already said them once to a room she had believed was not hearing her. She was standing beside the bed. The clock said 1:14. The city outside was the deep blue of the middle of the night. She had been doing this for 15 years. She had stood beside beds in the deep blue middle of the night more times than she could count, and she had done the work, and she had maintained the discipline, and she had gone home, and she had come back, and she had maintained the distance, and she had been careful about what the work was and what it was not. She looked at his face. She thought about 12 nights, and about the book, and about a hand that moved at 1:14 and then stopped. She thought about what she had said on the 9th night, and the 20 minutes of it, and the specific part at the end that she had not meant to say, and had said, and which was true, which was the part that was the problem, which was the part she could not qualify away because it was simply true. She leaned down and she kissed his forehead. It was small. It was the gesture she had made before in rooms like this one, at the end of long placements. The small, private thing that she did when no one was watching, and which was not for the patient and not for the work, but for the part of herself that she was careful about, not confusing with the work. It lasted approximately 2 seconds, and it was gentle, and it was the kind of thing she had done 6 times in 15 years and had never done in front of anyone. His hand came up and caught hers. Not quickly, not with the sudden grip of surprise, with the specific certainty of a hand that had decided to do a thing and was doing it. Reaching for her hand, where it had been resting on the bed rail beside him, and closing around it with a hold that was gentle and complete and entirely deliberate. She did not move. He did not move. The room was the room it had been for 12 nights, quiet and dark, except for the lamp at the bedside, the clock ticking, the city outside. She was standing beside the bed, with her hand caught in his, and she was not pulling away, and he was not releasing her, and neither of them was doing anything except being in this position, in this room, at 1:14 in the morning. On the 12th night, she looked at his face. His eyes were closed. His breathing was the breathing she had memorized. He was still in all the ways that he was still, which was what she had been looking at for 12 nights. She looked at her hand in his. She thought he is awake. She thought it not as a surprise, because some part of her had known since the 9th night and the hand that moved at 1:14 and then stopped. And some part of her had known since the book moved. And some part of her had known since the 2nd night when the book was at the near edge, and she had looked at it and had not looked at it again. She thought it as the completion of something she had been not completing for 3 nights. He was awake. She did not say anything. There was nothing she had the language for at 1:14 in the morning, with her hand caught in the hand of a man who had been awake for an unknown number of nights while she sat in the chair by the window and was careful about the work. The clock ticked. The city was outside. The room was quiet. She thought about 12 nights, and she thought about the 20 minutes on the 9th night, and she thought about the specific part at the end that was true. And she thought about the fact that he had been in this room with her for some portion of those 12 nights, and had heard some portion of what she had said, and had moved a book to the near edge of the table, where the lamp was, and she did not know when, and she did not know how many of the nights, and she did not know what any of that meant, and she was not going to find out tonight. She was going to find out later. His hand was holding hers with the gentle certainty of something that had decided to hold and was not going to let go until it decided to. And she was standing beside the bed, and she was not pulling away, and she was not saying anything, and the room was the room it had always been, and neither of them was moving. At 1:23 his hand released hers. He did not grip it first, or press it, or make it into something that required a response. He simply opened his hand and let hers go in the specific way that things were released when they had been held for exactly as long as they needed to be held. She straightened. She stepped back from the bed. She picked up her chart. She looked at it for a moment. She wrote 0, 1, 1, 4. Patient condition stable. She wrote the temperature and the IV rate and the position check. She wrote nothing else. She went back to the chair by the window. She sat down. She was very still. At 6, she would brief Thomas. At 6:15, she would leave. That was the plan, and it was correct, and she was going to think about everything else after she had done those 2 things. She looked at the bed. She looked at the man in it, who was not sleeping. She looked at the window. She was careful. She was always careful, but careful. She was beginning to understand. Was not the same as honest. And she was going to need to think about the difference. And she was going to do that after 6 o'clock, which was 5 hours away, which was what she was going to be in this chair for. She held her chart. She was still. The clock ticked, and the city was outside, and the room was very quiet. She did not go home after the briefing. She briefed Thomas at 6, and she left the room, and she stood in the hallway, and she thought about going home, and she thought about her apartment and her kitchen and the refrigerator and the 6 hours of sleep she needed. And she thought about the chair by the window and the clock and the 9 minutes between 1:14 and 1:23. And she thought, I am not going home yet. She went down 1 floor, and she found the man who managed the building, and she asked him if there was someone she could speak with about the patient's status. Not medical, administrative. He looked at her with the expression of someone who was deciding whether this was his decision to make. And then he made a call, and he took her to a room with a table and 2 chairs, and he left her there. And 15 minutes later, a woman came in who identified herself as the coordinator who had called Roe at 2 in the morning 12 nights ago. Roe said, I need to speak with him. The coordinator looked at her. The patient is in recovery. His schedule is. I know his schedule, Roe said. I've been managing his schedule for 12 nights. She looked at the table between them. I need to speak with him. Not about the medical care. I need to speak with him about something else, and I need to do it before I leave, which I am not going to do until I've done it. The coordinator looked at her for a long moment. She had the expression of someone who was accustomed to people wanting things and assessing what category this want fell into, whatever category she placed it in. She made a second call, shorter than the first, and she nodded, and she took Roe back upstairs. Thomas was in the hallway and looked at Roe with the expression of someone who had expected her to be gone and was recalibrating. She looked at him and she said, 5 minutes. And he looked at the coordinator, and the coordinator nodded, and he stepped aside. She went into the room. It was the first time she had come into the room in daylight. The curtains were open, and the morning was coming through the window at the angle that morning came through east-facing windows, which was flat and clear, and without the quality that night had. And the room looked different, which rooms always did in daylight after you had spent a long time in them in the dark. Smaller, more ordinary, more like what it was, which was a room where a person was recovering from something serious. He was awake. He was in the bed, but he had moved himself to a more upright position, which he had not had the strength to do when she arrived 12 nights ago, and which he had now, which was all of the clinical information she needed about how his recovery was progressing. He was looking at her when she came in, and he had the quality she had come to know from the nights of watching him, which was the full attention quality, except that she was now on the receiving end of it from a man whose eyes were open, and that was different from every other time. She stood inside the door. She closed it behind her. She did not go to the chair by the window. She stood where she was. You've been awake, she said. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. His voice was the voice of someone who had not used it in some time and was finding it again, lower than she had expected, though she had not known what to expect, and direct. For how long? He was quiet for a moment. 3 nights before the 12th. She absorbed this. 3 nights. The 9th night and the 10th night and the 11th night. The 9th night. The 20 minutes at 1 in the morning. The book at the near edge. The hand that moved at 1:14. The 9th night, she said. Yes. She looked at the window. The morning light came in at its flat, clear angle, and she looked at it, and she thought about the 9th night, and the specific 20 minutes of it, and the specific things she had said. And she thought about all of those things being heard by a man who was not asleep. And she thought about what it meant that she was standing in this room now and had the full inventory of everything she had said. She looked at him. I talked for 20 minutes on the 9th night, she said. Yes. You heard it. Yes. She looked at the floor. She looked back at him. Then you understand why I'm here, she said. He held her gaze. You said things you didn't intend to say to someone you believed was unconscious. he said. And now you know I wasn't. Yes. She paused. I'm not here about the forehead, she said. I want to be clear about that. The forehead that was something I do. At the end of placements. I've done it before. It's not. I don't need to explain the forehead. She looked at the window. I'm here about the 9th night. He was quiet. He was looking at her with the attention that received rather than assessed. And she had been on the receiving end of enough assessment in her life to know the difference. And the difference was significant. What specifically? He said. She thought about specifically. She had had 6 hours to think about specifically. Sitting in the chair by the window for 5 of them, and walking here from the elevator for the 6th. And she had arrived at a position on specifically, which was the true thing, and not the version of the true thing that she could say without being fully in it. I said I was going to miss this room, she said. And then I said it wasn't the room. She looked at him. That's the part I need to address. He held her gaze. I've been doing this for 15 years, she said. I have a good sense of what the work is and what it isn't. I've been careful about it for 15 years. I'm careful because I've learned what happens when you're not careful. And what happens is that you sit in rooms with people and you develop an investment in them that is not the work, and the not the work is something I have to carry out of the room when the work is done and into the next room, and it costs something, and I've been trying not to pay that cost for 15 years. She paused. And then 12 nights ago I came to this room and I did my work, and I was careful, and I came back the next night, and was careful and came back the next night, and I was careful all the way through the 9th night, and then I stopped being careful in the 9th night for 20 minutes, and I said out loud the thing that I had been being careful about not saying for 9 nights. He was very still. He had the stillness she had memorized, the chosen stillness of a person who was accustomed to being still. And she was on the receiving end of the full attention of it, and she was not performing anything for it. She was simply standing in the daylight of a room she had been in for 12 nights and saying the thing she had come to say. I said I was going to miss the room, she said, and that was true. But what I meant was that I was going to miss being in the room, which is not the room, which is what I said when I came back and qualified it. And what I meant by being in the room was... She stopped. She started again. You were not a room to me. I want to be honest about that. You became a person I was sitting with in a room, and the sitting with was the part I meant. And I know that is not a clinical fact, and I know it's not my business, and I know you have things about your life that have nothing to do with a nurse at 1 a.m, and I'm not here to make this something. It's not. I'm here because you heard what I said, and I would like to have said it in a context where both of us knew you could hear it. She was done. She had said the thing. It was in the room now, and she was not going to take it back, because taking back things was not something she had ever been good at, and because the thing was true, and she did not take back true things. He looked at her for a long time. She stood in the morning light and waited, which was something she was good at, and she did not manage the wait or fill it. He said, "Sit down." She looked at the chair by the window. "Not there," he said. "Here." He moved his hand to indicate the edge of the bed, the side she had stood on for 12 nights. And she looked at the indicated space, and she looked at him, and she thought about everything, and she went and sat on the edge of the bed. He was closer than he had been for 12 nights, which was to say present in the way that a person was present when they were upright, and their eyes were open, and they were looking at you from the same level. She had been looking down at him for 12 nights, and now she was looking across, and the difference was significant. 3 nights, she said. Why didn't you say anything? He was quiet for a moment. She recognized the quality of the quiet, which was the quiet of someone who was finding the right words for something that was not a thing they said often. I've been in situations where I was at a disadvantage for most of my adult life, he said. Every situation has its variables, and I account for the variables. When I'm not accounting for the variables, I'm in danger. He paused. I was in this room, and I was not accounting for any variables. I was not tracking anything. I was not assessing anything. I was not doing anything except being in the room and being... He stopped. He started again. Safe, he said. It had been a long time since I was in a room and not doing anything except being in it. I didn't know how to announce that I was awake without it becoming something that required me to start doing something. She looked at him. You were awake and pretending to be asleep because you didn't know how to be awake and in the room at the same time. That's accurate, he said. She thought about this. She thought about 15 years of being careful about the work, and she thought about a man who had been awake in a room for 3 nights in a row because he did not know how to be awake in the room, and she thought about the specific quality of that and what it said about how each of them had been navigating the same set of nights from opposite sides of the same equation. The book, she said. Something moved in his face, small and brief. Yes. You moved it. Yes. So I would know you were reading it. He was quiet for a moment, so there would be something honest in the room. He said, I couldn't say I was awake. I could move the book. She looked at the table where the book had been and was not. Where is it? She said. He reached to the other side of the bed and brought out the book, which had been on the far side, which was where he had put it when Thomas came in the morning. He held it out, and she took it, and she looked at the title, and she thought about a waiting room and a chapter she had read once and never gone back to. I never finished it, she said. I know, he said. You said so on the 9th night. She looked at the book. She looked at him. I'm not going to come back as your nurse, she said. I want to be clear about that. Whatever comes after this conversation, it's not going to be that. The work is done. I know, he said. The medical coordinator will arrange someone else for the remainder of the recovery. I've already told her I don't want someone else, he said. I told her this morning. She looked at him. You can't manage your recovery without nursing care. I'm aware of that, he said. I said I didn't want someone else. I didn't say I wouldn't accept the medical care. He held her gaze. I said I didn't want another nurse. I want you to come back. She sat with this. She was sitting on the edge of the bed that she had stood beside for 12 nights, holding a book she had read, one chapter of, in a waiting room, and a man was looking at her with the full attention of his open eyes and telling her he wanted her to come back, not as his nurse, which she had just said she was not going to be. And she was thinking about what the alternative was. I don't know how to do that, she said. Come back as something that isn't the work. Neither do I, he said. I don't know how to have someone in a room with me who isn't part of the work. He paused. I'm suggesting we find out. She looked at the book in her hands. She looked at him. She thought about the 9th night and the 20 minutes and the thing she had said that was true. And she thought about a man who had moved a book 3 inches, to be honest. And she thought about careful and what it cost and what it gave, and whether the 15 years of it had been worth the wait. She said, I need to think about it. Yes, he said, you do. I'm going to go home and sleep, she said, and I'm going to think about it. All right, he said. She stood. She held the book. She looked at him for a moment across the morning-lit room. You should have said something, she said, on the 9th night. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I didn't know how. She looked at the book in her hands. She put it on the table by the bed, on the near edge, where the lamp was. Then she went to the door, and she opened it, and she went out into the hallway, and she walked to the elevator, and she went home. She slept, she thought. The thinking took the rest of the day and into the evening, and she sat with it the way she sat, with things that required her full attention, and she looked at it from all sides, and she arrived at something. She came back on a Tuesday, not Monday. She had thought about it on Sunday, which was the day she went home and slept, and thought, and she had thought about it further on Monday, which was the day she had needed to think about it in the specific way that required distance from the room, and distance from the conversation, and distance from the morning light, and the book on the near edge of the table. She had gone to the library on Monday, and she had sat with a coffee for 3 hours, and she had looked at the thinking she had done on Sunday, and she had found it was not complete, and she had completed it. And on Tuesday morning she had called the coordinator and she had said, "I'm coming in today," not as the nurse. And the coordinator had said nothing for a moment, and then had said, "All right?" She wore her own clothes. This was the first thing that was different, because for 12 nights she had worn the clothes she wore for work, which were specific and practical, and which communicated what she was in a room. And today she was not wearing those clothes. She wore the jacket she wore on Tuesdays when she had nowhere specific to be, and the bag she carried when she was a person going somewhere rather than a professional arriving somewhere. And she stood outside the building, and she thought, "All right?" And she went in. The man at the door looked at her, and looked at her clothes, and looked at the bag, and he called someone, and he let her through. And she went up in the elevator alone, and she walked down the hallway that she had walked down 12 times at night, and which looked different in the Tuesday afternoon. The specific quality of afternoon light that was ordinary and horizontal, and nothing like the blue of the deep middle of the night. She stopped outside the door. She had not knocked on this door in 12 nights. She had a key. She had given the key back to Thomas at the end of the last briefing. She knocked. There was a pause. She heard something inside. The specific sound of movement, of someone getting out of a bed or a chair. And she thought he is moving around the room. She thought about what that meant clinically, which was that his recovery had progressed significantly in the 48 hours since she had seen him. And she thought about what it meant in terms of what she was walking into, which was different from the room she had left on Sunday morning. The door opened. He was standing. He was wearing the dark shirt and trousers of a person who had dressed themselves rather than been dressed. And he was holding the door with one hand and standing with the careful weight distribution of someone who was managing a healing body with the specific attention of a person who had been told what not to do and was doing none of those things while appearing to do all of them. He was upright. His eyes were open, and they were on her. She looked at him standing. "You're supposed to be in the bed," she said. "I've been in the bed for 13 days. He said. "You've been in the bed for 13 days because you were shot," she said. "The surgical site is clean," he said. "The fever is gone. The IV has been out since yesterday. The day nurse cleared me for limited mobility this morning." She looked at him. "Thomas cleared you for limited mobility," she said. "Getting out of the bed to open the door is limited mobility. Standing in the doorway is at the upper range of limited mobility." "I'm aware," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. She said, "Go. Sit down." He looked at her. "I'm not your nurse," she said. "I'm asking as a person who has been watching someone recover from a gunshot wound for 12 days and who has a professional opinion about what standing in doorways does to healing tissue." She paused. "Go sit down." He stepped back from the door. She came in. He went to the chair by the window, which was her chair, and she thought about this and decided not to make it into anything. And she closed the door and she stood in the room. It was the room. It was the same room it had been for 12 nights, except that the hospital bed had been raised to its most upright configuration, and there was a tray on the table beside it with a cup and a book, which was the book, which was on the near edge of the table beside the lamp. She looked at the room in the Tuesday afternoon light, and she thought about the same room in the deep blue of 1 in the morning, and she thought about what had been in the room on those nights that was not visible in the daylight. And she thought about the 9 minutes between 1:14 and 1:23 on Sunday morning. And she thought, "All right." She went and sat on the edge of the bed, the same edge, The bed was configured differently, but the side was the same side, and she sat on it, the way she had sat on it on Sunday morning, and she looked at him in the chair by the window, and he looked at her across the room. "I thought about it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I thought about it for 2 days," she said, "on Sunday and Monday." "What did you arrive at?" he said. She looked at the book on the table. She looked at him. "I arrived at the thing I was trying not to arrive at for 12 nights, she said. "Which is that I came to this room 12 nights ago to do a job, and I did the job, and somewhere in the middle of doing the job, I began to be something other than the job, and I tried to be careful about that, and I was careful until the 9th night, and then I wasn't careful, and I said something true, and you heard it, and you did something honest back, which was to move the book 3 inches, so there would be something honest in the room. And then on the 12th night, I did something I do at the end of placements that I have never done in front of anyone, and you caught my hand and held it for 9 minutes, and I had 2 days to think about what I wanted to do about all of that. And what I arrived at is that I am here." He held her gaze. "I don't know what comes after here," she said. "I don't know how to do this. Being in a room with someone and not being there for the work. I've been telling you that. And you told me you don't know how to have someone in a room with you who isn't part of the work. And I thought about that for 2 days, and I thought about whether those 2 things together added up to something we could figure out, or whether they added up to 2 people who didn't know how to be in a room together for reasons that had nothing to do with work." She paused. "And I think they add up to the first thing." He was quiet for a long moment. He had the stillness she had memorized, which looked different from this angle, from the edge of the bed rather than the chair by the window. And she was looking at it from a new angle and finding that it was the same stillness and also different. The way the room was the same room and also different in the afternoon light. "Why?" he said. "Why do you think the first thing?" She thought about the answer she had arrived at on Monday in the library, the one that had required the extra day to complete. "Because you moved the book," she said. "You couldn't say you were awake. You found another way to be honest. That's a person who is trying to be in the room and doesn't know how. Not a person who doesn't want to be in the room." She paused, and I came back on Sunday morning and said everything I said in the daylight, which is not how I do things. I don't say things in the daylight that I say at 1 in the morning. The daylight version costs more. I said it anyway. That's a person who is trying to be in the room. Also, he looked at her across the afternoon-lit space between the chair and the edge of the bed. "You're in a room with some significant variables," he said. It was not a warning exactly, and not a disclosure exactly, but the specific thing in between. The statement of a person who was trying to be honest about something difficult without making it into more than it currently was. "I know," she said. "I've been in the building for 12 nights. I know what the variables are in general terms." She looked at the window. "I'm not going to pretend the variables don't exist. I'm also not going to make a decision about the variables without more information. And I'm not going to get more information by not being here." She looked at him. "So I'm here." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached out, and he picked up the book from the near edge of the table, and he held it across the space between them. She looked at the book. She looked at him. "You said you don't go back to things," he said. "I said, I'm not good at it," she said. "You came back," he said. She held his gaze. She took the book. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and she thought about going back and what it cost, and what it meant that she was here with. The book in her hands on a Tuesday afternoon, in a room she had been in for 12 nights, and was now in for the 13th time as a person, rather than a professional. "I'm going to start from the beginning," she said. "Not from the chapter I read, from the beginning." He looked at her. "All right," he said. She opened the book. She looked at the first page. She looked at him. "I'm going to read it out loud," she said. If that's acceptable. He held her gaze. Something in his face did the thing she had been watching for 12 nights from across the room, and which she could see much more clearly from this angle, which was a small movement that was not performing anything, but was simply the expression of someone who had heard something they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. And the waiting was over. Yes, he said, that's acceptable. She looked at the first page. She began. The room was the room it had always been, quiet in the way it was quiet, the city outside the window, the afternoon light coming in at its Tuesday angle. She read, and he listened, and the first page became the second, and the second became the third, and neither of them said anything except what the book said, and it was enough, and it was the beginning of whatever came after the 12 nights, and the book moving, and the hand holding, and the 9 minutes, and the daylight, and the 2 days of thinking, and the return. And it was not the work, and it was not the work, and it was simply what it was, which was 2 people in a room together, learning how to be in the room, and that was, she thought, exactly where she had said she wanted to be. She kept reading. He kept listening. Outside, the city continued. Inside the room, the Tuesday afternoon light moved across the floor in the way that afternoon light moved, slowly and without drama. And the book in her hands was the book that had moved on the table 3 times and been the only honest thing in the room on the nights when honesty was difficult. And she was holding it and reading it, and it was the first time in 15 years that she had done something in this room that was not the work, and was not careful, and was not the distance between herself and the person in the room. And it felt like the thing she had been sitting next to for 12 nights without knowing she was sitting next to it. She read the first chapter. She had read it before, in a waiting room, a long time ago. She had not gone back to it. She was going back to it now. From the beginning, which was where you went when you wanted to do something right. She finished the first chapter. She looked up. He was looking at her. She put her right hand flat on the bed beside her, the same hand he had held for 9 minutes on Sunday morning. She looked at him across the room. He stood. He walked across the room with the careful weight distribution of a person managing healing tissue, and he sat on the bed beside her, on the same edge, and he put his hand over hers, flat, the way a hand was placed when it was placed there rather than caught there. And the difference between placed and caught was the difference between the 12th night and today, which was that today they both knew exactly what they were doing. She looked at their hands. She looked at the book. She turned the page.